Welcome everyone to our digital seminar, Defend the Defenders, Environmental Activism and the Battle for the Planet. My name is David Goyes and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law of the University of Oslo, where I have specialized in the study of environmental conflicts and of environmental crimes. Today, we will be talking about the work of and threats against environmental activists through the life of Berta Cáceres. The urgency to talk about environmental defenders resides in that without them, the harms inflicted by the perpetrators of direct degradation of the environment and of abuse of non-human species would steadily increase. The importance of environmental activists, the high rates of violence committed against them, and the individual and community suffering that their repression creates, makes understanding their work and the threats they face of vital importance for the protection of our planet and the species inhabiting it. In 2019, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations expressed grave concern at the situation of environmental rights defenders around the world and condemned the killing of and all other human rights violations or abuses against them. These environmental activists are individuals and groups who, in their personal or professional capacity and in a peaceful manner, strive to protect and promote human rights relating to the environment, including water, air, land, flora, and fauna. And they are under acute threat. Frontline Defenders reports that of all human rights defenders murdered worldwide in 2019, 40% were environmental activists. The primary explanation NGOs offer for the high homicide rate is the competition over resources and the exploitation of nature that the extraction of these resources demand. First, the former Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on the situation of human rights defenders reports that the instigators behind the violence are often transnational corporations involved in mining, hydroelectric production, agribusiness, or forestry. Although the executors are usually state agents, private security agents, or paramilitary forces. The existing academic explorations of homicides of environmental activists blame corporations, denounce governmental collusion with corporations, and highlight the problematic meshing of public and private security forces. Italian criminologist Vincenzo Ruggiero claims that loyalty to economic liberalism is what facilitates the homicides of those standing in opposition to entrepreneurship. Roy and Martinez Allier explain that homicides of environmental activists are part of the larger ecological distribution conflict in which the struggle is over environmental costs and benefits in the context of power and income inequalities that intersect with race, class, and gender. Navas, Mingorria, and Aguilar Gonzalez highlight the failure of governmental institutions to ensure justice by passively ignoring previous homicides of environmental activists. Glassebrook and Opoku posit that politicians benefit economically from facilitating the operation of transnational corporations on local territories and thus deploy their connections with military and paramilitary forces to threaten local opposition. Myself and Nigel South argue that an important factor in the homicides of environmental activists is the growth of the private security sector operating on behalf of multinational companies. Additionally, we note that private interests direct public police and military forces, thus facilitating violence against environmental activists. Today, we will be talking about all those topics through the life of Berta Cáceres. Berta's murder in 2016 triggered international condemnation and inspired environmental activists throughout the world. For that purpose, joining me today is journalist and writer Nina Lacani, author of the book Who Killed Berta Cáceres, published by Verso Books. Before I give the word to Nina, I want to announce that we will have some minutes for questions at the end of the event. Please write your questions in the Q&A box that you find on the lower part of the screen. And then at the end of the event, we will answer your questions. If we don't manage to answer the questions, the channels of communication with us remain open after the event. Having said that, I want to welcome you, Nina, and ask you, who was Berta Cáceres? And why did you want to tell the world about her?
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. So Berta Cáceres was an indigenous leader from Honduras who was killed in March 2016 after leading a long campaign to stop construction of a hydroelectric dam, internationally funded hydroelectric dam on a river considered sacred by the Lenca people. It was a dam that had been licensed along with hundreds of other environmentally destructive projects after the 2009 coup in Honduras, with mostly on indigenous and rural territories, without any consultation, without debate in Congress, without any sort of, and without proper environmental impact assessments, you know, and these contracts were awarded. They were, you know, contracts as well for energy with the National Energy Company at very favourable rates for the companies involved, you know, not favourable for the public. And so she had been involved in this long campaign, which had led to a campaign of terror against her and her organisation and the Lenca community, which involved threats, stigmatization, defamation campaigns, violence, the killing of other leaders, false criminal charges, sexual harassment, and you know, the whole sort of gambit of strategies that we became very familiar with during the counterinsurgency wars of the, you know, earlier of last century. And you know, the objective of that campaign was to silence her, was to neutralize her, to eliminate her, because of who she was. You know, she was a powerful social leader. She was incredibly smart, capable. She had a great ability to communicate and convince people, you know, whether they were campesino farmers or they were world leaders. You know, she was an incredible leader. She was a smart political analyst, and that made her dangerous. All of these things that made her dangerous, and they were unable to silence her in any way. And so she was targeted because she was considered, I believe, a bad example. Here we had not only a social leader, but she was a woman, and an indigenous woman, and that for the network of powerful elites involved who run Honduras, and also those who benefit from the economic model in which the extractivism industry sort of operates, was unacceptable, you know. And so I would say that Berta's murder was not exceptional, in that many of environmental and land defenders had been killed before her, and they've been killed since. But she was an extraordinary person, and I think that is, you know, which made her and her murder emblematic. And so my reason for telling her story was that it tells her life and death, tells a story, a much wider story of Honduras, and the, you know, the extractivism model in which so many defenders are being you know, targeted and killed.
Thank you, Nina. We also have special guests throughout the seminar. They have recorded videos for this event, and I have the honor to present first the intervention of two admirable human rights defenders. You know them very well, Nina. They are Sofia Marcia and Melissa Cardoza, former colleagues of Berta Cáceres at the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. So we will see that video now.
Yo soy Sofía Marcía.
Yo soy Melissa Cardoso y estamos hablando desde Honduras.
Y queremos compartirles cómo el legado de Berta sigue vivo en las propuestas que las mujeres, ahora mismo frente a la crisis que nos está dejando el COVID, está dejando lecciones fuertes que vale la pena, no, es decir, si no partimos de eso ahora mismo, pues vamos a seguir igual, y pues nosotras estamos proponiendo otras formas de relacionarnos y otras formas de entender la vida, y pues Berta sigue viva ahí, ¿no? En las compañeras del COPIN, en sus compañeras como Meli, como otras, como Juana, etcétera, ¿no? Que también son parte de un proyecto más grande que se llama la Asamblea de Mujeres Luchadoras de Honduras, y eso, ¿no?
Y bueno, nosotros decimos que Berta Cáceres Flores está sembrada en el corazón de todas las rebeldías, porque precisamente era una mujer cuya identidad política era ser luchadora. Ella no se adscribía a una lucha, sino a todas, ¿verdad? Una complejidad que tal vez desde el pensamiento de, no sé, académico, de reflexión, cuesta mucho entender, pero que Berta encarnaba mucho esto, es decir, que ella tenía la capacidad no solamente de entender que ser antirracista, antipatriarcal, anticapitalista, era una urgencia de ese tiempo que se demanda mucho en el movimiento social, en el feminismo, por ejemplo, al cual yo pertenezco. Es una manera, ella tenía una manera no solo de entenderlo, sino de vivirlo, ¿no? En la práctica.
Sí.
Era una mujer que tenía un ejercicio político que lograba, pues, ver de manera muy integral todas estas opresiones y todas las emancipaciones que podían venir de ahí, que es lo que estamos viendo ahora también.
Sí, con esas luchas, ¿no? Del racismo, antirracista que estamos viendo cómo se levantaron en Estados Unidos primero, pero que siguen siendo tan vigentes y que también eran vigentes en ese pensamiento, ¿no? Y en ese accionar político de Berta.
Sí, Berta tenía un pensamiento antirracista muy poderoso, un pensamiento anticlasista, ¿verdad? Que era fundamental en ella, pero también tenía un pensamiento feminista que radical, en el sentido de que ella no luchaba por mejorar las condiciones de vida de las mujeres, porque sabía que el patriarcado, el capitalismo no se puede mejorar, hay que cambiarlos profundamente, o del todo.
Sophia and Melissa were talking about a phenomenon that we often forget, that several forms of oppression often intersect. In our contemporary society, elements of race, gender, sex, sexuality, class, ability, nationality, citizenship, religion, and body type often intersect to deepen forms of oppression. In the case of environmental conflicts and homicides of environmental activists, nationality, gender, and ethnicity are central factors. Regarding ethnicity and nationality, indigenous persons comprise 40% of all victims of homicides of environmental activists around the world. And a further 40% of all homicides of environmental activists take place in Latin America. Indigenous environmental activists are mainly attacked in southern countries like Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and the Philippines. Indigenous peoples have also been overcriminalized, treated as terrorists. Authorities label them as anarchists, criminals, terrorists, and violent people. While indigenous peoples are overcriminalized, the crimes against them often go unpunished. The high risk to indigenous peoples is often the result of global competition over access to resources. Despite awareness of those risks, indigenous peoples remain active resistors. In theories of resistance, such mental dissonance, the difference between what we know and what we do, is explained by a deep bond with nature. Indigenous communities do not want to own land, but see it as the house that ensures their survival and that of their culture. Regarding gender, Joan Martinez Alier and Gretel Navas document several homicides of well-known female environmental activists. They also highlight that within international public opinion, the repression towards female environmental defenders is little known. The Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, led by Berta Cáceres, embodied the intersection of several oppressions. So I want to ask you, Nina, what did the Council fight and keep fighting for?
So COPIN was created in 1993 by Berta and her former husband, Salvador Zuniga. And they created COPIN, soon after returning from the front line of the Salvadoran civil war, where they had participated in that war. And I think once they had things that were fundamental to the creation of that organization that never changed. So they were always going to be a peaceful, non-violent struggle, and it was a struggle for indigenous rights. And from very early on, and this, because, and this is sort of true wherever you would look, indigenous rights are absolutely inseparable from land rights. They're inseparable from the respectful, sustainable use of Mother Earth, of natural resources, which you just alluded to. It's not about owning land. It's about a respectful sort of exchange between humans and those resources. And so it was always about that. And it was also very much about sort of basic human rights. The indigenous people of Honduras, including the Lencas, back in that time, weren't even recognized as existing. They were indigenous people, that there was a sort of overwhelming majority thought that they had been wiped out, through the sort of through the centuries of colonialism. So very early on, I think the struggle was about reivindication, about a recognition that they still existed, and there's these very incredible, famous pilgrim marches that they led when all 7 indigenous groups ended up marching to the capital, Tegucigalpa, on foot, really as a sort of statement of intent. Here we are, we are no longer going to be, left on the sidelines. We are here and we're going to demand our rights, And so very much the early part of the struggle was that, I think, but also, it was always about the land. I mean, every battle in Latin America is about land, and land and natural resources. And so it was about trying to regain territories that had been stolen, that had been forcibly taken from their communities, and initially that, put them against loggers, illegal loggers, like you talked about, mining, always sort of a really important sort of threat and danger across the continent, including Honduras, and then increasingly so-called sort of cash crops, like the agribusinesses, and renewable energies, and these are sort of really the main threats. Also tourism, in Honduras as well has been a key thing, and so that has continued. I mean, I think from very early on, because to understand why Berta was killed, you have to understand who she was and where she came from. And she grew up during the dirty wars, really heavily influenced by the civil wars and the sort of proxy Cold Wars that were going on around her. Her home and her mother's side of the family were always involved in the social political struggles, and she was so from a very young age she began to understand that local struggles were really manifestations of global, regional, economic, political, military, social context, and COPIN was born like that. And so from very early days, Berta was the international sort of voice of COPIN, and she traveled to many countries, to many different, to spend time with many indigenous communities, to learn from them, and really that, I think, cemented and helped her evolve her thinking on how every social struggle, every small local struggle was, really a manifestation of what was happening globally in terms of what their economic model was, in terms of what their international finances were demanding, in terms of what policies were being pushed, yeah, so COPIN was always about sort of understanding the local in terms of the global, but also, I think it's a pioneering organisation in that it's really the first and possibly still one of the only very few indigenous groups that puts equality and every kind really at the heart of what it did in every way, so gender equality, as Melissa said, Berta and COPIN, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-machista, anti-patriarchal, and also in terms of sexual diversity, from the early 2000s, sexual diversity and the sort of struggle for equality in sexual diversity has been a key part of COPIN, and that really was pioneering, and also having strong female representation in the organisation at coordination level, but also in the communities, and so I think and also it's also a very political organisation, not party political, but very political in terms of actually making those links, that actually when Berta campaigned hard with regional groups against free trade agreements, because she understood that these were just the latest sort of tool, the latest weapon in terms of sort of rolling out colonial economic or neoliberal economic sort of powers. These would be used again to displace and to take land and to marginalize indigenous populations. So I think it was many things, but I think those sort of key areas which, as you rightly say, intersected, and she was very good at that. She didn't see these things as existing in isolation. When she was in the community talking about a new a mine or or logging or whatever, she was there, talking about machismo. She was challenging machismo, sexism, misogyny. So at every single sort of meeting, she never let these things go. And I think, as her colleagues just said, every struggle was Berta's struggle. She never turned her, her head away from any injustice. But those key elements that I've just mentioned stayed, with COPIN, with her. Things changed around her. The coup obviously was just a big bit before and after, in terms of how much of her work and COPIN's work became about crisis response, whereas I think COPIN was very much about fighting for things. It became, it was forced in the last 10, 12 years, 11 years to constantly be responding, resisting, to crises, and that really, you can see that starting with the coup.
Thank you, Nina. You have mentioned many elements that we will be discussing today. The struggle for land, the machismo culture in Latin America. And we have a new guest who is Catalina Toro Perez, an expert on environmental conflicts in Latin America, who has written a lot about struggles over land. And she's also professor at the National University of Colombia. Before we play that video, I want to remind the audience that you can ask questions by using the Q&A button at the lower part of the screen. If you write your questions there, we will be replying them at the end of the event. But now, let us listen to Professor Catalina Toro.
Extractivism in Latin America can be defined as an accumulation modality based on a large-scale exploitation of natural resources for export purposes. Due to the commodity boom at the beginning of the 21st century that included mining and oil exploitation projects, this model experienced rapid growth, which determined the direction of regional economies. Its progress had generated multiple environmental conflicts, as well as the contamination and destruction of ecosystems which ended traditional ways of life and displaced population. The struggle for survival involves the defense of land, culture, and nature by social movements and communities affected. A key element in understanding the complexity of capitalist extractivism in Latin America is that it is promoted by multinational companies of the north, but also increasingly by multinationals in the south. It is the case of the Brazilian multinational company La Vale. This multinational, present in more than 30 countries around the world, is responsible for the rupture of 2 dams in 2015 and 2019 in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. The consequences of this rupture include permanent contamination of more than 300 kilometers of Doce River and the release of 60 million cubic meters and waste sludge that killed 19 people, destroyed villages, and left more than 1,000 inhabitants homeless and without water. Latin America and the Caribbean is the most dangerous region for environmental activists and opponents of extractivism. In Brazil, 700 environmental defenders have been killed since the beginning of the 21st century. In Colombia, more than 300. There's been an increasing murder of indigenous and local communities leaders, mostly women in Honduras and Guatemala. Latin America and the Caribbean have 8 of the 10 most violent countries in the world. Violence against these populations in its multiple expression is exerted by transnational corporations, agents of organized crime, paramilitary groups, and by state actors. The various forms of violence in women, where sexual violence is added, as leaders of social movements and defenders include threats against their families, arbitrary detentions, court cases, evictions, forced displacement, and often murder.
Catalina was talking about the role multinational and transnational corporations play in the creation and fueling of environmental conflicts. This shows that the world is connected. Many social scientists are by now aware that the social world is shaped by complex interactions of events taking place in diverse geographies, even as they have specific local effects. Globalization scholars have coined the term glocal to signal that no cultural, economic, or political event is absolutely global or absolutely local, but that it occurs at the intersection of the 2 geographies. For biological phenomena, the interweaving of different geographies is even more important. The entire planet is a system composed of climate, oceans, land surfaces, ice masses, and vegetation in a complex interrelation. This means that an ecological event in one location affects other geographies as well. Forestry in the Amazon not only affects Amazonian ecosystems, but the entire Earth system, because the carbon dioxide emitted when the trees are felled contributes to the warming of the atmosphere of the entire planet. Based on this knowledge is the proposition that to understand the phenomenon of homicides of environmental activists, it is necessary to consider the interactions between the local, the national, the regional, and the global. Simultaneously, the world is divided. The colonizing structure, north-south, remains intact, sustaining an uneven distribution of political, economic, and epistemological power and capital between the global north and the global south. This allows northern countries to frame international legal instruments that regulate human interactions with nature, extract and dispose of environmental products from southern countries even at the cost of environmental destruction and conflict, and impose environmental practices on the south to the detriment of local practices. Having all this in mind, Nina, I want to ask you, what had international dynamics to do with both the work that Berta Cáceres undertook and the events that led to her murder?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just to sort of, I'll repeat this because I think it's important to always remember, you know, that Berta, like many of the defenders that we could, you know, that we could talk about, you know, her life and her death didn't occur in a vacuum. You know, they occurred in a both local and global context, you know, and by that I mean, you know, a global economic, political, military, religious, social context, you know, and yeah, and her work as well. And so I've already, you know, I mentioned this already, just, you know, her formation took place, you know, in a small corner, you know, of Western Honduras near the El Salvador border, but because of that geography and because of who her family were, you know, she sort of grew up seeing, you know, the sort of the consequences of a proxy war being fought out in her region, you know, which was a huge influence. I mean, you know, when she was a very young kid, she would accompany her mum, you know, to the refugee camps on the Honduran-Salvadoran border. Her mum was a midwife and nurse, you know, and just sort of, you know, and sort of they'd take in medications and they'd help, you know, some of the people there living in like concentration camp conditions. And they'd also be taking messages out from guerrilla fighters, you know, to people that were staying in El Salvador. So it was just that sort of, you know, that the globalization came to her, really. Do you know what I mean? What, you know, what was happening in that case between Russia and the US, how that was affecting her particular, you know, corner of the world. So I think she was just, everything about her life was, you know, international in some ways, you know, but she was, you know, her work was always focused on working on what her base, the Lenca people. You know, she was an absolute true grassroots leader. She didn't lead from the top. Decisions were taken by the base, right? And so really the objectives were always about meeting the needs and the demands and the priorities of the Lenca people, right? The members of COPIN. But she understood that, to, you know, even if you were talking about you know, crops or access to or a mine or whatever, these all had international dynamics and elements, you know. So she spent a lot of time, you know, educating herself and learning about, you know, what, you know, trade agreements, international financing, you know, when the Washington Consensus was sort of rolled out, really, you know, that sort of imposition of by international financiers like the World Bank and the IMF and the US Treasury, among others, you know, for communal sort of territory, land, to be taken and sold as a, you know, to be treated as a commodity. That idea that the market had the answer to everything, you know, the way out of poverty for Honduras, like every country, only way out was to put a price on its natural resources. Its wealth, you know, its wealth lay in the ground, you know, and it had to become a commodity. And so that, you know, that's where these land struggles begin in Honduras, really. You know, I mean, it's not to say before, you know, Honduras is the original banana republic, you know, huge swathes of that country. Honduras, I think, has, by the Americans, very much been always considered a sacrifice zone. You know, it's been like a laboratory for many things that, I mean, geopolitical, you know, environmental. Now, I think with the climate crisis, I think it probably sees Honduras and Central America as a bit of a laboratory, you know, where the climate impacts are already being felt very strongly. And so, yeah, and so, sorry, just I went on a tangent there, but, you know, so I think she grew up, and that was the environment. And her murder was was absolutely the same. I mean, the coup in 2019 unleashed, you know, this wave of terror, of violence, in which has never stopped, right? You know, that, you know, the international community did not, you know, the perpetrators of the coup, that network of elites that orchestrated, implemented, and have benefited from the coup from the last 11 years, have never felt any consequences, not economic, not political, not social. You know, I think a few members of the few conspirators lost their US visas temporarily, you know, but that was it. That was it. I mean, that political, well, I would call it a political, I would call it a criminal organization masquerading as a political party that has ruled Honduras since the coup, and has really just stripped away its wealth, stolen much of its wealth, you know, and has really turned, cemented Honduras as a criminal state, has never had any consequences from the international community, you know, apart from a few months to start with, where there was a temporary halt of aid, you know. International investors have gone in full blast, you know. They cannot say that they don't know what's happening in Honduras, because people like me are telling them every single day, you know, activists, defenders, journalists, they cannot say they don't know, you know. They cannot say that they don't know that the internationally required consultation required by the ILO 169, to which Honduras is a signatory. Honduras has ratified that convention. Not a single project has had a proper consultation, not a single one. And the international investors cannot say they don't know, because people are telling them. In the case of Aguazalca, the dam that Berta was eventually killed for opposing, she wrote to the Dutch bank FMO. She wrote to all the international investors in 2013, pleading with them, you know, not to invest, not to go ahead and sign this investment deal, because people were already being killed. She was already on the run. There was already sort of false charges against her. They cannot say they don't know, because they do know, you know. And the thing is, the way that these financing arrangements are made, are organized, they are organized to be opaque. It is incredibly hard to track the money. Why? You know, even when that money is coming from development banks, so taxpayer funded banks, it's incredibly hard to trace that money, you know, not just by communities, but by people who dedicate their lives, you know, to looking for the money. You know, it's incredibly difficult. And so you have that level of, I think, complicity, you know, active and inactive complicity. And then you also have, in the case of Honduras, where you know, in the case of Bertha's murder, that all of that criminal activity that was, you know, implemented against her and her organization and the Lenca people was only some of it, a small proportion of it was carried out by hired sicarios, hitmen, hired thugs, right? Most of that terror and repression was enabled by the state. You know, the company executives, the company managers had enough influence, were able to ensure that they had paid informants in the community who were feeding information about what Berta and what was planned. They could then call their contacts, high-level police officers, people in armed forces, in security ministry, to make sure these peaceful rural protests had urban SWAT teams that are trained to fight organised crime in cities, deployed to those places to police them. They were able to influence prosecutors and judges. You know, there's I tell this story in the book of a hitman that had been working for the company and terrorising the community, who was wanted on a murder charge and picked up for having a weapon. The company paid for a lawyer and were able to influence the judge and prosecutors there, and bribe the family and pressure the family who were the witnesses in this crime, so charges were dropped. There is complicity, direct and indirect, at every level, and the international community knows this. I mean, the US is still Honduras is its main geopolitical ally. It still sees Honduras and uses Honduras as a military satellite for its war on drugs. It invests millions and millions of dollars every year on training and supporting the same Honduran security forces that repress defenders. And also the UN have accused of being involved in dozens of extrajudicial killings, and yet that continues. And it's not just the US. The US is absolutely omnipresent. But I think the role of every single international investor, they cannot say they don't know, because they do.
And you mentioned something that we are going to discuss now again, which is the consequences for the perpetrators, the impunity, the lack of consequences for many of these actions. And for that, we have our next guest, who is my dear friend, Carlos David. He has been working hard for several years for the defense of human rights and the building of peace in Colombia. So let us now listen to Carlos David.
My name is Carlos David Rodriguez Velázquez. I am the regional leader of the Unidad de Búsqueda de Personas Dadas por Desaparecidas, which traduces in the search unit of missing persons in Colombia due to the armed conflict. I lead a team that is placed in the border between Colombia and Venezuela, the Arauca region, and we have to do the work to search hundreds of people that still are missing due to the armed conflict and the relationship with the territory. In Colombia, there are more than 100,000 missing persons related to the armed conflict. This particular situation is very related with what we are talking in this moment. The killing of Berta Cáceres and the persecution and impunity that is also a continuum in all Latin America. In Colombia, the armed conflict have taken hundreds of thousands of lives, and it has also have hundreds of thousands of people who are looking for their missing persons, and they don't have answers to know what happened and where are the people that have disappeared. I think states and the society have to compromise and to give answers to the people that are looking for their missing persons and to the people that are demanding justice, like the family and the friends and the society that lost with the death of Berta Cáceres. The search unit of missing persons in Colombia represents a hope, and it represents also the perspective of the civil society. Those efforts of social leaders and human rights defenders and environmental defenders are clue to our work and have to make the institutions and the state change and adapt to relieve the suffering and to aspects that rely in the fight against impunity and for peace. Thank you.
Carlos David was talking about the importance of giving answers to those that have been victimized by violence. Truth commissions have become an emblematic element of transitional justice processes ever since the South African transitional process. Truth can have many forms and sources, ranging from factual or forensic, to personal and narrative, to social or dialogue, to healing and restorative. Truth is also linked to international legal imperatives, namely the duty to prosecute and the duty to repair victims of human rights violations. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances have all recognized the right to truth. The right to truth, also known as the right to know, is based on three considerations. First, that societies must draw upon history to prevent violations from recurring in the future. Second, truth has a particular value to heal individuals and restore their sense of dignity to the victims. Third, truth is essential for accountability. Now, aware of the importance of truth and thinking about the case of Berta Cáceres, I want to ask you, Nina, what has been the response from the justice system to the murder of Berta Cáceres? And how does that response affect the work of current human rights defenders?
So, you know, just generally speaking, impunity is the norm in Honduras and for all violence against defenders, human rights defenders, environment defenders. That is a norm. So in that way, Berta's case is also exceptional in that there has been some partial justice. But I think it's just important to outline how we got there. You know, the initial response from the justice system in Honduras was exactly how the evidence that we've seen the dam company planned it to be. You know, the plan A was to blame it on a crime of passion, which is, you know, we've seen that many times before. Plan B was to blame it on a conflict within Copin. Plan C was to blame it on Gustavo Castro, a Mexican environmentalist, a good friend of Berta's, who was there, the only eyewitness, and who was shot but survived by playing dead. What the perpetrators and the state of Honduras did not plan for or did not consider would happen was a massive international response. You know, she was at the time of her murder probably the most well-known defender, at least in the Americas. You know, she had been awarded the Goldman Prize, and the previous year, you know, she'd had an audience with the Pope. So she was very, very well known, and the campaign against the Aguas Arca Dam had been an international campaign. So that outpouring of international outrage, and just to remember that at this time, 2016, this was before pre-Trump administration, when, you know, the State Department and you know, they still had some very decent elements in it. There was, you know, the huge pressure and also from the Senate and law, you know, members of Congress and other countries for a proper investigation. You know, so what we saw, you know, is in the end, 8 men were charged and tried in 2018. At the end of 2018, one was found not guilty, rightly so, and 7 men were convicted. I'll just tell you who they were. I mean, so that, you know, some of those men were basically a hired hit squad. You know, poor young Honduran men who killed for money. You know, at least a couple of the people were trying to get in that group, were trying to get money, raise money in order to pay a coyote to get to the United States to look for a better life. You know, so and then you had a group of middlemen. You know, so and these included 2 people linked to the dam company. And also you had in that group of 7, 3 people with military links. You know, two of them had been trained by the US over the years. One is just noteworthy in mentioning because it also brings us into what the prosecution, I would argue, on purpose didn't investigate. Mariano Diaz was a active special forces major at the time of Berta's murder. He had been under investigation, we later found out at that time, for drug trafficking and kidnap. He was a highly decorated officer, trained by the US. He'd fought in Iraq along with the coalition forces, had been a UN peacekeeper, on his way to be promoted to be lieutenant, and he was under investigation, so his phone was tapped. So actually, so there is, you know, and yet, when he was arrested, the very next day, the armed forces gave him a dishonourable discharge. You know, no waiting for the trial, nothing. And there was a clear attempt by the armed forces to put him up, you know, to pass him off as a bad apple, because actually to look any further may have opened some doors into structure, you know, into criminal structures operating within the armed forces. We have a case where there is this, you know, a senior military figure, active military figure. They find a gun in his house. That gun is never sent for ballistics analysis. They do not manage to take any data of his phone, his tablet, his laptop. The only person they say that they can't get any data of. What is it that they didn't want to know, right? You know, and I think that was a clear indication that they were not, you know, that the armed forces as an institution would be protected, you know. And then we had evidence that was, you know, some of which was which was uncovered mainly through the phone data, but a lot of it which didn't actually get talked about in the trial, you know, where you had these phone conversations where senior police officers, ministers, attorney generals were being talked about by the company, of people who they would go to for help either before the murder or after the murder. You know, at no point do you hear that in the evidence. So there was a clear decision to protect the political class as well. You know, there was an incredible moment in the trial when we're hearing the transcript of a phone conversation between the president of the damn company, who I should mention has been charged as a mastermind. Again, a US trained former military intelligence officer, hasn't been tried yet. And so the first arrests are made in the case, and he's having a phone conversation with the senior person of the majority shareholder, who is a member of one of the ruling clans of Honduras. And they're having this conversation about the arrest, you know, and they get to a certain point, and we are asked by the phone expert asks the judges or lawyers, shall I continue? And there is agreement that no, she shouldn't continue because the rest of the call is personal. Actually, when I read the transcript of the rest of the call, what they're talking about is, and using names, who can they go to in government to sort out this mess? They mention ministers, they mention the Attorney General. And in no one's world can that be not considered relevant in terms of actually complicity in this case. So there were clear decisions by who I don't know to protect the elite, you know, the institutions, you know, the political class, the armed forces. You know, remember that I had reported really soon after the murder that Berta's name had appeared on a military hit list weeks before her murder. You know, she had denounced that herself, you know, and there was a clear, you know, plan, and that was executed to protect these. So I would say we have had partial justice, you know, that the people who have been charged and who were convicted should have been convicted. But as of yet, nobody who ordered, who paid for, who enabled, or who benefited from Berta's murder has faced justice, you know. And I think the fact is that, you know, the impunity, I think Berta's case is exceptional, but what it has failed to do, because there has been no consequences for the rest of the sort of you know, for the rest of the state in any shape or form, that it's become just a, you know, it's a one-off. This has not triggered a strengthening of the criminal justice system in any way, you know. And what we have seen, people have still continued to be killed, definitely less so than they were before Berta's murdered. But what you really have now is a massive ramping up of criminalization, and you see that across the region, and it's really telling in Honduras, you know. And so you are silencing and weakening struggles, individuals and their movements by these very aggressive, lengthy sort of criminal charges, again, which are only possible because of the state actors. You know, private companies cannot do that alone. You know, they can't. They have to have prosecutors, judges, police, all of these, prisons involved in that. And again, just to finish, international investors cannot say they do not know that is happening, because they do.
And this is, of course, a pattern in the crimes of the powerful. It is usually the impoverished and marginalized who get punished, but then the powerful remain free. There are so many lessons to learn from this case. So I really invite the audience to learn more about Berta Cáceres, to read the book, Who Killed Berta Cáceres. And we have just 5 minutes to close up. And we have just enough time to respond to one question from the audience. And I'm going to read it to you, Nina. It says, rarely people who live in the big cities engage into defending and encountering those same struggles led by peasants in regard to environmental protection. How can one help or contribute into generating a broader consciousness among everyone? Which ones are those actions that can really make a change?
Yeah, I think this is a question lots of people ask. I mean, I think I would draw attention to current uprisings that we're seeing in the United States, where I am, and across the world, you know, that, and a real sort of connection of many dots, you know, racial justice is economic justice. Economic justice is, you know, social justice. Social justice is gender justice. You know, racial justice is environmental justice. These are all you know, you can't have one without the other. They are so interconnected, you know, and so actually, and so I think it is overwhelming, right? There are so many struggles, so many injustices. Everybody's really busy. What I always tell people is like, pick one thing, pick an issue that you're passionate about, whatever it is, you know, trees, I don't know, do you know what I mean, bees, whatever it is, you know, police brutality, whatever it is that you feel passionate about, pick one issue, pick one country. That might be just somewhere that you've been yourself, or you've seen a documentary on TV, or your friend has been there, or you've read one story about it, and just start there, you know, start looking at where you are, how your government or how banks or other investors in your country are involved in that particular issue in a particular country. You know, just bringing it back to Bertha for a second, you know, after she was murdered, but when the elections took place and there was this total violent crackdown in order for the current regime to stay in power, 6 months after that, I discovered that my country, the United Kingdom, had sold spyware to Honduras 6 months before the election that had then been used to track defenders. And, you know, in that context, it's defenders of all kinds, political opponents, social activists, students, teachers, environmental activists, you know, uncover those things, work with other NGOs, bring them to journalists' attention. But, you know, when you start to think about everything, it's overwhelming. Pick one thing, pick one country, and just start there.
That is a fantastic answer, Nina. And that's exactly the same that I have always thought. We should focus on our skills, pick an issue and work on that. And the issue of environmental activists is fundamental, as we have been discussing throughout the event. Indeed, considering the stability of high yearly figures of homicides of environmental activists, the United Nations Human Rights Council highlighted the urgency of producing new, reliable knowledge about homicides of environmental activists. That is the work that I, as a scholar, have been undertaking. That is the work that you, as a journalist, have been doing. But most importantly, this matter requires the collaboration from all of us. Thus, to close the event, I will give the word to our future generations, to the members of the Fridays for the Future movement. Thank you all for attending this digital seminar. Thank you, Nina, for answering all these questions, and enjoy the last video of this session.
Indigenous people and the tribal people are the defenders of the environment, but for the last whole decade they were fighting to get their land back from the government. Because of the policies made by government to exploit the nature, their lives and their land is in danger. That's why Defend the Defenders is a movement where we ask people to come together, join this movement and help us to defend their voices.
And it's just heartbreaking to see that not more people know about environment defenders, and that's why this Defend the Defenders campaign is so important, because it's raising so much awareness and it's doing big steps in connecting the world all together to show that we're here, we are listening to our environment defenders. The youth of the world is doing this. Why aren't you? Why aren't you listening to us? Why aren't you amplifying the voices of our environment defenders? And that's what we want to happen with the Defend the Defenders campaign. We want to make sure that after this campaign is done, it doesn't end there. We have the conversation, we keep it going, we learn and listen from our indigenous knowledge, we talk to our indigenous activists and we integrate with them and we really listen to them, because in the end, they know what we need to do to save our planet, to battle this climate crisis. We need our environment defenders.